Mercury is a planet in astrology that can show how your genius or the power of your mind is really unlocked. And understanding the power your mind holds can be the difference in making a pivotal decision that could change your life. It can be the tool you tune into to improve how you communicate, which could also unlock an abundance of opportunities, or it could be through understanding the wiring of your mind that you can alter your perception of the world, understanding what a blank canvas the world actually is, and thus understanding where your true mental power lies. But to understand Mercury in astrology, we must first understand the concept of information. Information is the objective coding language of the universe. While yes, thoughts and ideas can be subjective or even false, the objective existence of a thought or an idea, no matter how crazy or false it is, puts that information into the universal database. Most personal planets in astrology are marked as either a luminary, benefic, or malefic due to the almost subjective connotation that these placements can bring. Mercury doesn't fit into one of these categories. No. Mercury is neutral. Information in itself is neutral until it is filtered through the human experience. And so Mercury in astrology tells us how we filter thoughts and information through our mind, how this information is processed, and then how that information is communicated. It's our relationship with information, which is neutral. And so understanding the way your informational filter is designed could be the key to unlocking your own personal sense of genius. And I do want to make it clear, though, all 12 signs have valid and useful ways to process information. It's not just Gemini and Virgo energy that is right while the rest of the signs are wrong. It's just that Gemini and Virgo operate within a landscape that is defined by the idea of information itself, and these are signs that naturally deal with data in its purest form, but it is worth noting that the scope of data that's actually out there is vast. The world isn't just a dry and boring computer that abides by what we know as the laws of physics, and there is a landscape for all signs to find their genius. For example, there is a sense of genius to be found using the data that energy and intuition give us, such as with a Pisces or Cancer Mercury. There is a sense of genius that can also exist with the data that our body or our experiences give us, such as with an Aries or a Sagittarius Mercury. And so this video will go through how information is filtered, processed, and communicated for all Mercury placements by sign and house. And this video will not only help you unlock your genius, but it will also allow you to tune into your Mercury placement on a whole new level so that you can apply your mind to meet your fullest potential in your everyday life. And so go down to the description, look for your placements, look for your timestamps, and let's unlock your genius in 3, 2, 1, go. If you have an Aries Mercury, the information that you take in is filtered very instinctively. So rather than waiting for all of the variables to arrive before categorizing data, this placement catches the spark of a concept as it happens. And because Aries is a forward-moving, action-oriented energy, tremendous momentum really drives your mental processing. So information is evaluated for its immediate use as soon as it arrives, making the filter feel like a visceral reaction to the environment instead of a prolonged calculation. And by treating data as fuel for action, the mind operates like a rapid-fire engine that rations input based entirely on its utility and ability to initiate, results or movement. In other words, you really process information in real time. And so context as well could be discarded to maintain cognitive speed. If you don't find something relevant, you're going to dump it in the trash. And so when it is time to share your thoughts or to communicate, your communication style is very direct, or it could be very rapid, not out of aggression or bluntness, but out of a mechanical necessity to keep the momentum going and to cut through the noise. And so for a real life example, imagine maybe you're reading an article or like a complex manual or just something where there's a lot of detail. Instead of reading linearly from introduction to conclusion, the eyes kind of scan the page until they hit a core point or locate exactly what matters to the thesis. And the moment that single sentence lands, your mind could spark, grasping the author's entire premise without needing to digest the supporting paragraphs. And so this thought process does not build to a conclusion through a sequence of steps. It kind of teleports there the second a usable spark appears. And abstract theories are instantly transmuted into actionable mental starting lines, really establishing a launch pad immediately by tossing aside any variables that could slow things down. And so the greatest strength of this placement lies in its speed, decisiveness, and ability to slice through complex data to find the core issue. However, this does carry an inherent risk of cognitive impatience. And because your mind kind of races so quickly to the finish line, it is very easy to miss vital nuances or secondary variables that alter the reality of a situation. And so to achieve deep understanding with this placement, practice the conscious pause, because this is essential. And since this initial filter is exceptionally fast, the most brilliant revelations you could come up with actually arrive when there is a forced delay or just one extra moment, and allowing those secondary pieces of information to catch up to the initial instinct builds a complete picture without sacrificing that natural momentum that your mind has. If you have a Taurus Mercury filters information very steadily. It likes to handle only one variable at a time, and being rushed through data could kind of make you tune out, as the underlying mechanic of your mind requires grounding a piece of information, then understanding its weight, and then recognizing its value before accumulating anything new. It's very sequential, and new input needs space to marinate. And even if a preliminary opinion does form initially, because you can still be very opinionated, the true processing happens gradually while sitting with the data, making the filter feel like a deliberate digestion. And ruled by the planet Venus, your mind probably carefully grades the usefulness and physical reality of incoming information, and the processing style is very architectural. It attempts to give abstract data a physical shape or a practical application. And if a concept cannot be grounded or proven useful, it is usually discarded. And when it comes time to share these ideas, the communication you do is very deliberate and practical, not out of slowness, although you guys have beautiful, kind of like sultry voices sometimes, but it's usually from a mechanical necessity to speak only after anchoring thoughts into undeniable facts. And so just for an example, imagine you listen to somebody explain a new logistical concept. While they are talking, your mind isn't passively recording. It is actively trying to construct a physical or mental model of the explanation. And so if the speaker moves too quickly or relies heavily on buzzwords, your processing could halt or at least be delayed. And the thoughts require mentally holding onto step one, verifying its structural soundness, and then securing it in place before the brain permits step two into, kind of your mental space. And this internal workspace of your mind could be heavily guarded, refusing to accept new inputs until the current piece has been thoroughly tested for durability. In this way, the abstract coding of any system is really translated into a mental brick wall where you lay down the foundational understanding one piece at a time until your idea is complete. And so this placement really possesses incredible retention, thoroughness, and a rare ability to turn abstract chaos into workable reality. The primary risk with this placement, though, is mental stubbornness. You are a fixed sign. There could be a reluctance to pivot or adapt when new information contradicts a painstakingly built foundation. It doesn't mean you're not open-minded, but it could take time. And Taurus Mercury achieves deep understanding by breaking complex data into sensory actionable steps. And so those with this placement should generally avoid environments that demand frantic, shallow multitasking, because true brilliance for you will really shine the brightest when ample space is provided to methodically metabolize the information that you are being given. If you have a Gemini Mercury really possesses a completely omnivorous filter. It kind of acts as the ultimate note taker of life. And the mechanical aim here is to pull in as many communications or variables and data points as possible from the surrounding environment. And because this energy is very clever, investigative, and very curious, Mercury likes being in Gemini, the processing acts essentially as a rapid sorting mechanism. And the brain that you have
have could be constantly categorizing, connecting dots, or finding relational threads between seemingly unrelated pieces of data. And information is processed concurrently, making the filter feel like a live feed that simultaneously sorts multiple streams of input, really in the moment without requiring a pause. And gathering an abundance of info is precisely what prepares this mind for the world. And when these thoughts are communicated, the delivery is conversational and inquisitive, not necessarily to dominate the chat, but out of a mechanical necessity to bounce ideas off of others just to gather more data. Maybe they have something that you don't. And this really helps you to finalize the understanding of the data. And so just for a real life example, imagine sitting in a room where 3 different people are discussing entirely separate problems. To most observers, this could be disjointed noise, but internally the mind operates kind of like a highly complex weaving loom. And so instead of just listening to each thread individually, the brain could automatically generate associative links between them in real time. And it could mentally cross-reference a complaint from person A with a casual remark from person C, for example, maybe forming a new distinct thought pattern in the background while still actively participating in the present moment. Like maybe you're talking to one person, but you're seeing everything else going on, and various streams of chaotic data are actively processed until a highly cohesive synthesis naturally emerges from the static. And so the standout strengths here are unmatched mental agility. You are a mutable sign, but also the objective synthesis of a lot of data, but also adaptability. Virgo is known for its ability to, know a lot about one thing. You know a lot about a lot of things, if that makes sense. But the major risk, however, is overstimulation, because the Gemini Mercury could become so scattered by the sheer volume of data being pulled in that finding the core thesis or committing to a single conclusion could become a struggle. And so to find understanding, learning to physically ground your nervous system is so crucial. And by consciously narrowing focus to just one stream of data, when feeling overwhelmed, mental burnout could be prevented, allowing your natural intelligence to properly digest the information and know what to do with it. A Cancer Mercury filters information through the lens of situational context and powerful intuition. And so rather than merely absorbing dry, raw data, it pulls in the environment, the history, and the unspoken subtext surrounding those facts. You guys aren't just emotional thinkers. It's really about picking up the undercurrents, and information is processed retrospectively, making the filter experience kind of feel like a delayed resonance. Stepping away from the immediate environment is often required to fully digest the context and impact before the processing is complete. And because Cancer is driven by passion, but also deep empathy, the mind really seeks to understand the outcome and the emotional weight of the data. And so new input is constantly connected to maybe past precedents or, the impact to others as well, to really gauge its validity, maybe answering internal questions like whether the information ensures safety or preserves the true meaning. And when these insights are communicated, the delivery is very nuanced and protective. It's not out of defensiveness, but out of a mechanical necessity to really ensure that the listener grasps the holistic picture rather than just hearing lists of facts. When you communicate, it's not just this is my point, it's this is my point and this is what I mean by it. And so just for a real life example, imagine being presented with a completely new psychological theory. Maybe the mind doesn't process this by rigidly breaking down the academic definitions, even if you're very smart. Instead, the cognitive filter instantly searches the internal database you have for maybe emotional or historical precedent, and it processes the new data by asking, what feeling it evokes, or what is like the big picture of this. You may look at the facts, but you also look at like the emotional filtering of how this fact could actually work. And by translating raw facts into recognizable emotional resonance, the core meaning of the theory is intuitively understood long before the actual mechanics are memorized. Like you will feel the truth before you know the truth, but it still could be an intelligent truth that you know. And so ultimately, the true weight of the data is comprehended much faster than the literal words are processed. Unless you have a Gemini moon or a Virgo moon, then you're probably very cerebral, or maybe even an Aquarius moon at times. And so this placement holds a deep comprehension of complex human situations. You have a very good memory with this placement probably, and very high situational awareness. And the primary risk of this placement could be subjective bias for some people. And because context is processed so so heavily, maybe defense mechanisms or past experiences can sometimes be allowed to color completely neutral new data. And deep understanding for a Cancer Mercury arrives when objective facts are successfully separated from the personal resonance attached to them. Not every Cancer Mercury does this, but this could be a risk because emotions or information will be processed through the body, and the body is not always perfect. And by simultaneously acknowledging both the raw data and its emotional context, this placement becomes such a holistic thinker that you guys can really get results in whatever you do. Leo Mercury. I'm excited to talk about this because I know a lot of Leo Mercuries who don't really understand what this placement means. And so my interpretation of the Leo Mercury is that it filters information through the lens of authenticity, virtue, and ultimately human meaning. Functioning as an expressive energy that naturally radiates light, your mind, what this means is that your mind processes by integration, taking disconnected information and digesting it by finding how it fits into a cohesive, authentic, or vibrant narrative. This processing as well could be very creative, making the filter of your mind feel like a developing photograph. Maybe the initial data lands immediately, but it requires time to develop its full color, meaning, as well as the personal significance before a stance is finalized. And this isn't about projecting ego, but rather the fact that the mind requires data to have a heartbeat or a narrative center to make sense of it. If something doesn't mean something on a holistic level, you don't want to deal with it. And when you're sharing these ideas or these concepts, the communication is very warm and illustrative, not to show off, but it's out of a mechanical necessity to deliver an authentic narrative that clearly paints the picture for others and all of its nuance. And so just for a real life example, imagine trying to learn the mechanics of how a complex engine or biological system works. If the information is presented as sterile, dry, it's kind of like a boring textbook with no pictures and only words that use words that don't really matter, your mind could repel it and the data simply slides off. And so to effectively process the information, the mind must first find the hero of the system, or like the big picture of the system, by mentally personifying the data. It needs to really understand why the central component of what you're learning is essential and how it contributes to the life of the whole entity. And then once you get that big picture kind of understanding, you see how it radiates, that's when you can learn more of the details. And once that narrative center is located, the mind will illustrate, immediately locking the entire system into place and packaging dry data into compelling internal reality. And so you really need to kind of like turn things into a narrative for them to make sense. That's kind of the big picture of this placement. And so a Leo Mercury as well could be highly persuasive, capable of inspiring others, and brilliant at transforming dry data into understandable human narratives. But the main risk is a pride of thought, which could manifest as a tendency to reject objective data if it threatens a core philosophy that you have, or it feels undignified to your worldview. And this placement really thrives and achieves its deepest understanding when the mind is allowed to temporarily entertain concepts that do not immediately validate its own perspective. And by treating objective data as a tool to enhance the inner light rather than to threaten it, the intellect becomes completely unshakable, and you really have the power to do so much with your mind. If you have a Virgo Mercury, welcome to the club, because a Virgo Mercury will filter information with high resolution precision. Mercury loves being in Virgo and governed by a need for practical application, which is why Mercury is so strong. It's not just that we go into the details, but we want to apply as well. The mind is really geared towards intense analysis, acting as a fine mesh sieve that effortlessly caches details, inconsistencies, and practical variables others miss. Very good at pattern recognition, and information is processed sequentially and iteratively, making the filter feel like an ongoing editing phase. And raw data could be taken in quickly, but true processing involves continually revisiting, refining, and cross-checking the information until it makes perfect practical sense. You may read something 10 times to understand it, and the mind dissects and refines, taking data apart to see exactly how the gears work while constantly asking about utility and optimization. You probably took apart at least one thing in your home growing up. For me, I broke light bulbs. Yeah, I kind of regret it. But yeah, you might have done that. You might have built with Legos. And when you are dispensing this information, the communication is very precise and helpful. You don't try to be critical, but it's really, you communicate the way you do out of a mechanical necessity to clarify, correct, or provide tangible solutions to the environment you're in. And so just as a real life example, imagine listening to someone detail a highly convoluted problem. Your mind does not simply absorb the narrative, it involuntarily begins filtering the story through a strict mesh screen of utility. And so while the person speaks, maybe your thoughts focus entirely on dissecting the variables, isolating irrelevant details, highlighting actionable points, and then mentally organizing the messy data into a clean sequential timeline of cause and effect. And the chaos of the situation is processed by instantly categorizing what is useful and what is waste, relying on a subconscious sorting algorithm that ensures the final picture works in reality, not just in theory. Your mind could feel like a little bit of a computer sometimes, even if it's a messy computer at times, because trust me, we're not perfect. And so the core strengths of this placement are maybe you're very accurate, you're very good at problem solving, and you have a mastery over the mechanics of a particular subject. But the risk here, and you know this already, is analysis paralysis, because it is easy to lose the forest for the trees, becoming so overly critical of the data for lacking perfection that forward movement can stall entirely. And so to reach deep understanding, a Virgo Mercury must consciously zoom out. Before refining the micro details of any situation, explicitly remind yourself of the macro purpose. And this is essential because once that ultimate goal is established, the detailed processing becomes an unmatched superpower. You have to give yourself a goal first, because when you do, you're unstoppable. For a Libra Mercury, information is filtered very relationally. And what I mean by that is that this energy understands the world through the lens of others, and data is processed based on, how balanced it is, how fair it is, and how one variable will interact with another. And if there's one thing to say about a Libra Mercury, it's that you want all of the data points because you want to come to a conclusion that is fair. And the mind will instinctively seek the counterweight to any piece of information. You could be a devil's advocate in some way. You could process information very comparatively, or maybe like through that dialogue in your mind. And this makes the filter experience feel like a pendulum swing. Processing is rarely finalized in real time because the intellect demands a period of oscillation between opposing viewpoints before setting on an equilibrium. This could happen fast if you have all the variables, but sometimes you'll have to take your time. And the mechanics of the mind is essentially that it requires a sounding board. It processes by weighing, comparing, and looking at data from multiple points of view to find the middle way. And when delivering a conclusion, the communication is often very tactful and diplomatic, not to people please, but out of a mechanical necessity to bridge gaps between conflicting concepts or individuals, or to ensure that the point is taken as it's meant to be delivered. And so just for a real life example, imagine reading an opinion piece on a highly controversial topic. As the mind takes in the author's argument, it cannot just accept the premise as a standalone fact. The very mechanic of this thought process requires a counterweight to maintain cognitive gravity. And so for every single point the author makes, the brain will automatically generate the opposing argument, even if there is total agreement with the author's stance, just, for the heck of it. And thoughts are processed not by looking directly at them, but by mentally mapping the space around them, requiring visibility of both the concept and its exact opposite to understand its true shape and test its structural validity. And so the filtering style here is very objective, exceptionally great at strategic thinking, and it has this rare ability to see the absolute validity in all sides of the equation. You probably would make a very great judge or a lawyer with this type type of placement, although you can do whatever you want to do. You could be great at communicating as well. But there is a risk, and I was going to say, of indecision. Not every Libra Mercury is indecisive. This is a risk, though, because the mind could become so caught up in weighing the variables that it fails to draw a conclusion or take a firm stance, especially when you cannot figure out if there is a right way. A good example of this is with opinions. Like, it might not be a right answer, if that makes sense. And a Libra Mercury reaches deep understanding by learning to trust its internal logic. And while the superpower lies in seeing the other side, practicing how to finalize a thought purely based on objective data is key, and you have to do this completely independent of how that conclusion will be received by others. And it's when you do this that your mind can really cut through so much information and do so much good. If you have a Scorpio Mercury, you filter information very penetratively, completely refusing to accept data at face value. And so the mind immediately looks past the surface presentation to locate an underlying motive, maybe the hidden structure or the core dynamic, or maybe what's just not seen. And information is processed asynchronously, making the filter feel like a slow, deep dive. And surface data is taken offline to be scrutinized and maybe even obsessively deconstructed in the background before resurfacing with the final conclusion. Although you could, spot someone right away and maybe they have a micro expression and something's off. You can process things quickly, but the more complicated it is, the more time you'll need to do so. And because Scorpio is deep, investigative, and powerful, the processing relies on intense deconstruction, systematically eliminating superficial fluff until only the undeniable core truth remains. And this creates a highly concentrated, almost obsessive mechanical focus. And when words are finally spoken, or when you do speak, the communication is often strategic and concentrated, not out of secrecy, but out of a mechanical necessity to output information only when it is absolutely necessary. And so just for a real life example, imagine reviewing a seemingly straightforward set of data or listening to a simple statement. Your mind's default setting is the assumption or concealed floor, meaning the top layer of information is going to be almost ignored, and instead your thoughts will act as a chemical solvent. Almost, it instantly attempts to dissolve the surface presentation to see exactly what motives are holding it up from underneath. And processing happens by mentally tugging at a single loose thread in a narrative until the entire superficial layer unravels, really revealing the unspoken truth beneath it. And by mentally scanning for inconsistencies, the structural reality that everybody else bypassed is successfully uncovered. And so the greatest strengths here are your deep ability for insight, unshakable mental focus. You guys are focused. Fixed Mercuries are, they don't give up if they want to figure something out. And you have an ability to solve complex mysteries or understand the deepest layers of the human experience. But the risk is suspicion or overcomplication. Being so accustomed to digging can lead to searching for hidden malicious meanings in data that's actually very genuine and straightforward. There isn't always a hidden motive. And deep understanding really requires the Scorpio Mercury to recognize that not every piece of information really demands that excavation. And by learning to accept simple data as exactly what it is, immense investigative power is saved for the things that actually require it, making your mind so good at whatever it sets its mind to. If you have a Sagittarius Mercury filters information in broad, expansive strokes. Maybe you're driven by optimism or an eagerness for new experiences, and your mind naturally seeks the overarching principle, the moral of the story, or the big picture, actively avoiding getting bogged down in the minute details that don't matter. And information is processed dynamically, making the filter feel like a sudden zoom out. And the macro meaning is grasped almost instantly upon receiving data, immediately connecting to a larger philosophy while often bypassing the micro details in the moment. And the mind processes by synthesis, tethering everyday data to massive beliefs or expansive concepts to understand what the information means in the grand scheme of the universe or your life. And when these grand ideas are communicated, the delivery could be enthusiastic or theoretical, not out of a lack of tact, but out of a mechanical necessity to explore concepts aloud and to share a broader vision of truth. You're going to share what matters, especially with the meaning that you specifically have gathered. And so just for a real life example, imagine being taught a very specific mundane mathematical formula. Your mind absolutely refuses to leave the information kind of in a micro context, and the moment the mechanics of the formula are understood, the thought process involuntarily launches upward, seeking a massive macro application. And so the brain skips the practical steps of applying it to a worksheet, instead instantly connecting the underlying logic of the formula to a broader concept, like the expansion of the universe or the nature of human growth. And the microscopic is processed by expanding it to the macroscopic, treating tiny pieces of data as essential keys to universal theories. And so this creates a highly visionary thinker. Maybe you have a very big macro understanding of things and an incredible ability to find meaning, optimism, and patterns in a chaotic world. But the risk obviously involves overlooking the fine print and falling into dogmatism, which is why Mercury doesn't necessarily like being in Sagittarius, but I promise you it's not a curse. And so maybe you could miss crucial practical steps because the focus is entirely locked onto the horizon. And so a Sagittarius Mercury must consciously ground grand theories in practical application where possible. That is the absolute key. And deep understanding really comes from forcing the mind to honor the fine, boring details, really recognizing that a massive macro vision is only ever as strong as the macro data supporting it. And it's when that you can do this that you are a true visionary who can really create anything that you want to in life. If you have a Capricorn Mercury, information is filtered through maybe a very practical and pragmatic lens. My mom is actually a Capricorn Mercury. You are kind of the type to view all incoming data based on its structural integrity, the security or the usefulness it has, and the potential for results. And you also are very sequential with your thought patterns. You build an idea one step at a time until you kind of get a big picture view. And if information lacks usefulness, authority, or application that is practical, the mind could filter it out as background noise or at least store it until it is useful. And processing is very systematic and deliberate, making the filter feel like an architectural filing process. And so data is placed in a mental holding zone to assess its viability, really meaning true processing for you requires time and quiet calculation. And so highly practical and results oriented, this mind really organizes data into hierarchies, mechanically asking about long-term viability and how concepts can be utilized to build a secure outcome no matter what it is that you're building. And when decisions are communicated, when you do talk, the delivery is typically very authoritative and concise. It's not because you're cold. This placement isn't cold, but you have this mechanical necessity to establish clear boundaries or outline things very definitively so that you don't really confuse people and that you make sure that the plan can be executed. And so just for a real life example, imagine a sudden chaotic situation occurring where a barrage of frantic information is thrown into the room. While others could experience a swirl of confusion or panic, your mechanical mental response is kind of by instantly deploying, what can we do with this? Thoughts do not process the emotion or the noise instantly, although maybe your emotions will process it. Your mind doesn't really go through that noisy emotional process. Instead, you kind of organize the incoming data by weight and priority. Okay, this is important. Let's look at this. And your mind automatically filters out subjective elements and isolates the heavy load-bearing facts, instantly generating a mental architectural blueprint of exactly what must be stabilized first. And even highly abstract dreams are processed by building a rigid hierarchy of execution. Even if you're ambitious, you need a plan to get there, and you are a planner with this placement. And so the core strengths of this placement are unrivaled strategic planning. Maybe you're able to keep logic in crises moments and the ability to manifest abstract ideas into concrete, lasting reality. But the risk with this placement is mental rigidity, as theoretical or emotional data could be dismissed depending on the rest of your chart simply because it cannot be quantified or utilized in a plan in a very easily to see tangible way. And so for a deep understanding, a Capricorn Mercury needs to intentionally allow space for unstructured brainstorming. Let yourself have a little bit of chaos when needed. And by granting permission to play with data without immediately demanding a tangible result, your mind opens up to innovative solutions it would otherwise automatically block, which could make you unstoppable in anything you do. If you have an Aquarius Mercury filters information very systematically. Operating with an energy that naturally walks to the beat of its own drum, your mind possesses a highly detached outside point of view regardless of what your emotional state actually is. You kind of like to see things from a big picture vantage point, but this vantage point really allows for the intake of so much data without becoming personally entangled with it. And information is processed maybe a little bit, sporadically, not in a bad way, but it makes the filter feel like you have a lot of digital downloads in your brain. There could be an initial appearance of detachment while the data is quietly gathering and processing in the background of your mind, only for the processing to finalize in a sudden brilliant flash of insight. It's like you put your thoughts in the oven, it does a little bit of work, and then ding, you have an idea that is outside of the box. And the mind really seeks patterns and anomalies from a bird's eye perspective, and it utilizes logic that is so sharp but decidedly non-linear. And so your mind jumps, really making connections that others could miss. And when these insights are communicated, the delivery is objective, but it could be a little bit unconventional in some cases. But at the very least, you like to outline your plan in a way that kind of, illustrates the genius of it. And it's not out of rebellion, but out of a mechanical necessity to challenge the status quo and to share your systemic overviews in a way that, really can push ideas to the future. And so just for a real life example, imagine trying to solve a complex puzzle that has completely stumped everybody else. Your mind may not process the problem linearly, tracing the standard steps from A to B to C. Instead, your cognitive filter operates like a drone lifting off the ground, mentally detaching from the established rules of the puzzle, trying to, find a better way to do it. And it pulls the perspective back until the entire system is viewed as a conceptual grid. And so data is processed in these flashes. Or maybe you recognize things very spatially, and it allows for the discovery of a solution that completely bypasses the logical sequence that everybody else is stuck in. You're very good at efficiency, and anomalies are found by observing the matrix from above. And so this placement really offers true breakthrough thinking, systemic objectivity, and the genius ability to solve problems from angles that nobody else can even see. But the risk is intellectual aloofness, as the mind can become so detached in its processing of the overarching system that it forgets to account for kind of like, maybe your own standing within the system, or, maybe you don't take care of yourself, or maybe you don't acknowledge your emotions if you're like really locked into a problem. And so an Aquarius Mercury can achieve deep understanding by actively working to ground abstract concepts into human reality that, includes those little kind of, micro expressions of human emotion. And by remembering the individual within the grand system, brilliant innovations can become practically applicable to the real world, and this is the placement of the scientist, the future thinker, or the person who comes up with an idea that truly changes humanity. A Pisces Mercury filters information very osmotically. It's kind of like a plant that absorbs water, if that makes sense. And your brain kind of acts as the ultimate energetic and creative sponge. And rather than just hearing the literal dry words being spoken, your mind will also absorb the atmosphere, the tone, and the energetic subtext of the data. Very underrated Mercury sign, in my opinion. And information is processed passively, making the filter feel like a slow absorption. Energetic data is taken in immediately, but the actual cognitive processing happens in the background. Maybe you require sleep, space, or an outlet to release your ideas or to fully articulate what was absorbed. Your mind as well is highly open. It could be very empathetic, kind of understanding, human emotion very easily, and very compassionate. Your mind processes very fluidly and non-linearly, even if you're smart or in a left brain field, but it easily translates rigid data into concepts or feelings or rich mental images to understand how seemingly disconnected pieces can flow together. And when these impressions are communicated, the delivery is done so in a way that kind of considers the environment. It's not out of vagueness, but you may have a mechanical necessity to convey an entire atmosphere rather than a single isolated fact, which means you have to pick your words carefully or you have to communicate it creatively. And so just for a real life example, imagine reading a highly technical dry set of instructions. The mind doesn't really seek to process the literal syntax of the words. Instead, your cognitive mechanic acts like a translator, automatically converting the hard, rigid data into fluid, visual, or emotional language, whatever is needed. And the step-by-step logic isn't processed directly. Rather, the impression of what the final outcome should feel like is absorbed, and thoughts take in the information in an energetic way, bypassing the conscious analytical brain entirely until there is a sudden innate knowing of how the mechanism works without the necessity to articulate the exact logical steps taken to get there, which is why, in my opinion, a Pisces Mercury can be a lot smarter than given credit for. Like, maybe you know things, but the communication of it is just a little bit different than what is by the book. And so the absolute strength of this placement is your boundless comprehension, your ability to read perfectly between the lines, and a genius capability for translating the unseen into something that is known. But there is a risk for mental fog. Because you are a sponge means that you easily absorb so much mental clutter and environmental energy from others that your mind could lose its own objective train of thought if it's not carefully managed. And so for deep understanding, a Pisces Mercury must develop strict mental boundaries and practice actively translating your impressions into concrete language, even if you have to start small. Because when this energetic intake is properly harnessed and formatted to fit a box that is easily digestible to others, your mind will become absolutely limitless, and you could actually become a genius who can do anything you set your mind to. If you have a first house Mercury, your intellectual genius is pure, unfiltered mental autonomy. So your mind doesn't just observe data like a lot of the other houses. It syncs directly with your physical nervous system. You can almost feel information in your body, which is such a gift because you process information with an unmatched reaction time. You can feel the velocity of an idea the exact second it hits your environment. And so imagine walking into a chaotic room. Before you've spoken a word, your mind has already aggressively processed the temperature, the dynamics, and exactly how you need to pivot. And so if someone challenges you, you don't file it away for later. You can process it on the spot, use the data to instantly sharpen your wit or assert your boundaries. And this is all because you are a real-time, full-body intellectual sort of, calculator, but not in a math sense. You're just like a processor. And because you experience thoughts as immediate physical momentum, your superpower is cutting through hesitation to make snap, highly accurate decisions. And whether you're launching a project, navigating a sudden interpersonal crisis, or just asserting a new boundary in your life, you can use data to cut through the noise, and you do not need a committee to make a move. Your body kind of already knows the answer. And this means that you learn best through trial by fire. Sitting passively in a silent lecture hall, for example, kind of fails to engage your mind. And so to truly lock in new data, you must apply it in real time, allowing the friction of immediate execution to teach your nervous system how a concept actually works. However, you do have to watch out for your ultimate trap, which is a battery drain. And because your nervous system physically feels your thoughts, chronic overthinking will rapidly exhaust your energy. And so to master this placement, you must deliberately manufacture physical outlets for your mental voltage. Pacing in a room during a phone call or taking a brisk walk to solve a problem. These are kind of vital to keeping your mind sharp and grounded so that you can use your genius to its fullest potential. If you have a second house Mercury, you are kind of like this master builder, and your intellectual genius is the ability to turn thin air into solid, lucrative reality. And your mind acts as an incredibly efficient filter. It can weigh the tangible, objective worth of every idea that you encounter. You don't just waste precious mental energy on floating noise. You use data to maybe build security, value, or undeniable stability in whatever it is that you're trying to do. So just for an example, picture a room full of people throwing around wildly expensive, chaotic ideas like a group trip, for example. While everybody else could get lost in the fantasy, your mind kind of calculates the actual logistics of things in real time, whether energetically or literally or monetarily, you name it. And you could speak up to provide the bottom line whenever nobody else is doing that. And people could implicitly trust your judgment as long as you're around the right people because it is rooted in fact. And so your superpower is kind of taking wild, abstract concepts and anchoring them into a step-by-step reality. Whether you're organizing a community event, you're structuring a creative hobby like me. Hello, I'm a second house Mercury, and this is kind of my outlet for that placement. Or maybe you're budgeting your own household energy. You can apply your mind to weed out the fluff and focus on what matters. And because you learn through practical utility, abstract theories could slip right out of your mind unless they're attached to a tangible outcome or something that's important to you. And so to deeply understand a subject, you must be able to physically build it, price it, or practically utilize it, or at the very least understand it from an elemental level. And the trap with this placement is intellectual rigidity, and you can easily dismiss a brilliant idea simply because it doesn't offer an immediate tangible payout. And so to reach mastery with this placement, try building a larger mental vault by dedicating time to pure brainstorming throughout your day, and allow yourself to explore theoretical concepts without immediately demanding a structural goal, and that can really help you unlock your genius. If you have a third house Mercury, you are a brilliant translator. Your mind operates as an open circuit that uses your immediate surroundings as almost this external hard drive. Let me elaborate. So let's say you're trying to solve a complicated problem. Sitting in a quiet room will only make your mind spin. And so to unlock your genius, you literally have to maybe speak the thought out loud. You could type or write it out furiously, or take a walk down a street while, kind of decompressing your thoughts. And you can use the friction and noise of the physical world or your immediate surroundings to finalize the ideas that you have inside of you. And your superpower lies in absorbing vast amounts of localized data. You can process it very, very quickly and translate it into a language that anybody can understand. You're kind of like a processor of information. And so whether you're untangling a misunderstanding between friends or you're optimizing a workflow, you can bridge the gap between theory and action, and you can kind of put your thoughts into reality, if that makes sense. And so silent, isolated reading will not lock data in your brain. You can learn through active conversational ping pong, and you absolutely must bounce a concept off of, another person or, maybe multiple sources to hear how the words actually sound in reality and to kind of like validate your ideas from another point of view. But be careful of getting trapped in the static noise of the day. And because your mind absorbs whatever is right in front of you, you're very observant with this placement. You can miss the big picture. So consciously and ruthlessly curate your daily environment, because an organized workspace and positive daily conversation or a good mindset are vital for your clarity and can really help you tap into your genius whenever it is needed. If you have a fourth house Mercury, you kind of operate as an emotional architect, or at the very least, you know how to get very deep with information. And your intellectual genius lies in staggering emotional intelligence, but also you have exceptional memory retention. These people have crazy memories because you kind of root things in your body. And so your mind acts as a highly guarded archive. It processes new information by meticulously anchoring it to your internal history. What I mean by that is when you're introduced to a new concept, you don't just blindly accept the surface logic. Your mind kind of runs an intense internal review, ensuring the data is kind of firmly anchored in your emotional or physical body, kind of like deep internally, before it can influence your actions. You're the kind who has to sit on things, if that makes sense. And your superpower is reading the deeply rooted emotional history of a situation, but also you could probably have a gift in communicating in ways that make people feel so deeply seen. And whether you're managing a highly sensitive group dynamic or you're navigating private family crises, you can really use data to create a deep sense of safety or security or rootedness in whatever you're doing. But also when it comes to how you learn through deep repetition and the active utilization of your historical memory. And so to successfully retain new information, you must intentionally map the data onto a past experience or root it into your body so that it does become a core memory. You need repetition essentially. However, you do risk becoming defensive with this placement. You could have a risk of filtering objective new data through the lens of old nostalgia or maybe ancient emotional triggers. And so it's important to remind yourself that the present moment is allowed to be entirely new. Consciously uncouple current information from your past biases. Do this consciously, and your mind will become an impenetrable fortress of true understanding where you can do whatever you set your mind to. If you have a fifth house Mercury, you have this ability to be a magnetic storyteller. Yes, even if you have it in like Capricorn or Virgo, and your intellectual genius is that you have the ability to be charismatic in whatever, direction you want to put your mind to. And you have a remarkable ability to, at the very least, inject life or joy into the driest of subjects. And your mind kind of operates like a combustion engine. What I mean by that is that you kind of process the world by actively looking for the spark or the human triumph or the dramatic tension buried in the data. You want to make it fun. And even if you're in a left brain field, you'd be the type to turn math into a puzzle if that's what you're into. And you can make information magnetic. And so think of explaining a deeply boring sequence of events, like a trip to the DMV, for example. A normal mind would kind of do it sequentially. Not gonna lie, I have a second house Mercury. I would do it like that. But your mind instantly optimizes the delivery. It adjusts the pacing and highlights the human element to ensure that your audience is captivated. And you refuse to tolerate boredom in whatever it is that you're trying to learn. And your superpower is kind of capturing human attention. And you can experience data as raw, creative material waiting to be brought to life. And you can apply your mind by locating maybe where the dramatic tension or the sense of joy is. And you refuse to let any project or conversation, take away from that joy. But also you have the ability to create so much with your information. The fifth house is all about creation. You can turn, objective, messy, weird data points into something that is like a beautiful flower. And if a subject does not have a pulse, your brain could refuse to retain it, and you can learn through gamifying things and, creating a narrative behind the information. And so to successfully master a new subject, you must turn the facts into a compelling human story, or at the very least, an engaging, joyful challenge. But the trap with the fifth house Mercury is prioritizing entertainment value over the cold objective truth, leading to unconscious exaggeration. Even in your own head, you could blow up things that aren't even that big of a deal. And so knowing when to let data simply remain flat, when to abandon a cause, and when to, really submerge yourself into the information is the ultimate key to maintaining your intellectual integrity. So go after what brings you joy, and that is how you can unlock your genius. If you have a sixth house Mercury, you are kind of like this master optimizer in whatever you do, whether it's like more creative or more logical, and your intellectual genius is very good at practical problem solving, and your mind operates like a master mechanic staring at a multifaceted, incredibly complex engine, and you want to optimize everything. And so you don't just philosophize about grand concepts or, big ideas. You are the type to break them down into bite-sized, digestible, and highly functional steps. And if you decide to tackle an intimidating, massive life goal, you're not the type to just view it as a romantic dream and, you're even not the type to say, hey, this is impossible and throw it away. You kind of shift into diagnostic mode. So you look at this towering, impossible ambition and you try to dismantle it into 30 actionable, microscopic tasks if possible. This is if you are operating at your best, you have the ability to do this. And when everybody else is paralyzed by a lot of chaos, your mind can click into an immaculate, hyper-focused sort of setting, if that makes sense. And you can anticipate the logistical roadblocks of, whatever you're doing before they happen and build the exact staircase required to climb the mountain that you're climbing. And you can bring order to things that don't have it. Your superpower is in how you diagnose things. You can find the exact flaw in the machinery of whatever system you work with, even if it's, this painting looks weird, or, oh, this spreadsheet's not working. And you are the type who will know how to fix it, even if you got to do trial and error. And whether you're decluttering a physical space or maybe you're untangling a deep, complex argument with another person, you can apply your mind by establishing immaculate daily steps that can guarantee successful execution. And when it comes to your learning style, you can learn through meticulous sequencing. If you have a lecture that's overly grand or purely theoretical, this could overwhelm you. And so to truly learn a subject, you have to break the mountain of data down into maybe daily checklists. And you have to master the micro steps until the macro concept is fully built. You are somebody who, you need repetition. You got to learn one element at a time until you can kind of bring it all together. And because your brain is a relentless scanner, you could always, find that crooked picture frame or, the thing that isn't working quite right in your life. And this could make you the type who could burn out very easily over, obsessing over things that are actually very microscopic. And so the key to mastery with this placement is purposefully scheduling time where your brain can be dumb. And so deliberately allowing certain parts of your life to be messy kind of gives your hyper-focused mind the rest it needs so that when you can apply your mind or when you want to apply your mind, you can do so to the best of its ability. If you have a 7th house Mercury, you make a very brilliant mediator, and so your intellectual genius is kind of this rare cognitive ability to hold two entirely opposing truths in your mind simultaneously without losing your center. And so your mind with this placement kind of acts like a sensitive scale that utilizes the friction of debate or the friction of, other people's perspectives to finalize your ideas, whatever those ideas are. And so you don't process information in a vacuum. Your best ideas are probably born in the space between you and another person. And so if you're making a massive life choice, for example, writing a pros and cons list alone in your room, that's not what works best with you because your cognitive processing clicks into high gear when you sit across from somebody else or, you get the perspective from another person, maybe even on social media. You could watch someone on YouTube or Reddit. You just need another person to sound board off of. And also it is really good when you can verbally explain your choice to another person. And you need to see, their body language. You like to see how other people maybe react to your data. Maybe their eyes will narrow, or maybe you need their nod of agreement for the concept to really physically solidify in your brain. And the pushback of others kind of acts as the actual physical processor for your intellect. And it's not because you can't form and validate the thought yourself, but having that soundboard of another person is just another very valid data point to validate, maybe what your ideas. And your superpower is that you have such an ability to be very objective with this placement, regardless of the sign, and you're probably very good at mediation as well. And you can step completely out of your own ego to argue an opponent's side perfectly, kind of finding the missing blind spots in any argument. You're willing to let your ego aside when it comes to your thoughts. And whether you're resolving a bitter dispute or weighing a personal decision, you actively seek out the counterweight to engineer a bulletproof and balanced solution in whatever you're doing. And you kind of learn it through relational mirroring and active debate. And so attempting to master a complex subject all by yourself without that sounding board could leave you with intellectual blind spots because you do require that sounding board. However, this constant mirroring could lead to intellectual codependency if you're not careful, maybe subconsciously molding your thoughts to placate whoever is right in front of you. And so for you, you have to practice making and committing to a final decision in absolute isolation before you ever allow it to touch the sounding board. And then so once you have your conviction, do not change your mind unless somebody brings up a point that makes sense. Because if you can use your brain correctly, not only do you have this incredible ability to understand others, but you are probably the best type of objective thinker who can come up with so many balanced solutions in whatever field or whatever, context you pursue it in. If you have an 8th house Mercury, you are very good at investigating. You are probably a very good psychological investigator in a lot of ways. And you have an intellectual genius that is unparalleled in its ability to investigate. It gives you sort of also this iron stomach for the dark, messy truths of reality that terrify other people. And what I mean by that is that your mind can operate with such strong X-ray vision, and it can automatically bypass surface level presentations to stress test the load-bearing walls of any situation. And you can systematically strip away the fluff of whatever you're analyzing. You can strip away the corporate jargon and the polite social lies until only a raw, undeniable core remains. And that is such a gift you can use to your advantage. And so just for an example, let's say that you're listening to an overly enthusiastic pitch while everybody else is nodding along, captivated by the shiny, smiling surface. Your mind will ignore the presentation completely. You can decode the subtle shifts in tone, maybe the defensive posture, or the glaring omissions, and you can read the loudest messages that are kind of hidden in the silences. And in other words, you're probably very hard to fool with this placement. And your superpower is psychological excavation, because you can apply your mind by aggressively stripping whatever people are saying. You don't just listen to words, and you can master the hidden realities of any situation. You're probably a very good sleuth as well, very good at investigating. And you're completely unfazed when something, does have that deep, dark truth, because you are just so aware of the realities of life. And you naturally distrust easy summaries or bright, shiny overviews. And so to truly learn a subject, you must be allowed to pull the concept completely apart, investigate the hidden mechanics, and question the motives until that truth is exposed. You need to be allowed to dive deep in whatever you're learning and to understand it on such a deep level, because that's how you will retain that information. But be wary of chronic suspicion, because you can easily become a detective in a world where no crime has been committed, and you can exhaust your nervous system by trapping yourself in obsessive mental loops. And intentionally turning off your scanner for the mundane daily interactions is the key to kind of keeping your sanity, because if you can save your immense psychological and deep investigative skills for, when it actually matters, that is when you can really unlock your genius and you can apply your mind to whatever you set your mind to. If you have a 9th house Mercury, you are a visionary synthesizer. And so your intellectual genius is this ability to, envision things. And you have this optimism about life that can stretch the boundaries of what is possible. And because you are optimistic and a visionary, you could have a vision that could completely shake whatever field or whatever application you're trying to put your thoughts towards, because your mind operates like a highly powerful telescope. You don't collect random trivia, you collect universal truths, the big picture, and you can process ideas through expansive experience. You can take disparate everyday facts and kind of synthesize or consolidate them into massive frameworks that can explain the laws of life. And a delayed flight for you, just for an example, isn't necessarily an inconvenience, because your brain can process it as almost like this sociological study of human patience. You can find the meaning in everything, which I know some people say is subjective, but that is such a gift when it comes to, how you filter information, because a passing conversation as well, just for an example with a stranger, can become a lesson to you. You can learn so much through every interaction you have, and you constantly stretch your own map of reality, and you can search for the higher meaning in everything, which is so useful because a lot of people probably wish they operate that way. And your superpower is basically the ability to see the big picture, and you can inject meaning into a microscopic and stagnant world. Even with data, you can kind of like consolidate it together and find that big picture. And so whether you're facing a minor frustration or overcoming a creative block, for example, you can use the data to instantly zoom out, connect, the tiny isolated facts to create this like grand overarching philosophy that gets everything back on track. And you can learn through philosophical expansion because, like, your learning style, for example, memorizing rigid flashcards could bore you. And if you want to absorb information, you need to know the moral of the story before you ever care about the plot. And you must understand the why behind the data. And this probably, because you're able to do this, makes you very good at translating data for others as well. You're probably a good teacher, and you might be good at language as well. But the trap with this placement is intellectual dogmatism or becoming so obsessed with the grand vision that you completely ignore maybe the boring logistical fine print required to actually execute it. And this could obviously differ depending on the sign of your Mercury, but you could, try to find the meaning in things where you can't really find meaning because meaning isn't found everywhere. And so if you can force yourself to respect the mundane, that is when your power can be, really applied, because a grand philosophy is only truly powerful if it can be practically applied to daily life. And so if you can do both, you can really apply your mind in such a visionary way that could truly not only expand your own horizons, but expand the horizons of the world in general. If you have a 10th house Mercury, you are kind of like this executive commander. And what I mean by this is that your intellectual genius is masterful executive command and the incredibly rare cognitive ability to build a lasting, visible structure for leadership. You're probably very good at, understanding things through a leader's eye. This is the placement of a leader. It's not just about career. And your mind with this placement can operate as a highly disciplined, unshakable boardroom. And so you can kind of possess this detachment with whatever you observe, even if you're normally a very emotional person. And you have zero tolerance for the fluff that doesn't matter when there is a mountain to climb. This doesn't just have to be with career, but anytime there is a goal, you know how to get from point A to point B. And you can naturally filter out trivialities and kind of focus entirely on the data that actually yields true mastery, or that builds authority, or that commands respect or results in the real world. And so let's say, for example, you step into a chaotic, terrifying crisis. You're the type where your mind, even regardless of your emotions, your mind at the very least does not panic. And when the room descends into fear, your mind will automatically assume the throne. You will run the internal diagnostic, identify the core of the problem, and you can speak with such calculated weight and precision. And your intellect is not designed for temporary fixes. Your mind is designed to build, monuments of your own competence. You are designed to come up with results, and to come up with results that last in whatever it is that you do. And your superpower is the ability to hold immense intellectual weight. You're willing to carry the weight, and you have this ability to structure pure chaos into a highly functioning reality. And whether you're taking charge of a disorganized event or you're plotting a 5-year goal, you can organize information into something that can actually build a result. And if for some reason something hits a roadblock, you are willing to pivot as well. And information for you only sticks to your brain if you can see how it directly, builds a long-lasting result. And you respect data that comes with credentials or proven track records, regardless if it's logical or creative. And you can master a subject through your ability to not only learn it, but to execute it in the real world. However, you do risk, having this rigid or formalized thinking, which could run the risk of suppressing your human vulnerability or your creative weirdness just to maintain maybe an authoritative stance or to maintain the high ground. And so for you, you have to realize that maybe your true impact or your true intellect will include all the variables, including your own humanity. And so by actively integrating your curiosity and allowing yourself to be vulnerable, allowing yourself to be imperfect at times, your intellect becomes far more relatable, and you can genuinely make such a big impact on the world. You can be such a great leader through your mind alone. If you have an 11th house Mercury, you are a futuristic architect with your mind. And so what I mean by this is that you have this ability to bypass the personal ego of whatever it is that you're analyzing, and you can operate like a highly advanced forecasting algorithm that can process information exactly with how the data will impact, not just yourself, but how this will impact the big picture, the collective network. And so you are kind of living 5 chess moves ahead of the present moment. And so maybe while others read about, maybe a subtle societal trend and wonder, how it affects their immediate life, your mind will try to forecast to see exactly how it can disrupt, society, human interaction, or the networks that you interact with 10 years in the future, because you don't care about what's trending today, although it will be a data point. Your mind is busy building the infrastructure for what humanity will need in a decade, or at the very least, that's how you filter through information. You filter it with the perspective of the future, with the perspective of your goals, with the perspective of society. And so you can test the future as well by kind of dropping concepts into the group dynamic. Maybe you use social circles as a living laboratory to actively watch how the collective absorbs the data. Maybe you kind of, let's say, for example, you're trying to figure something out. You will kind of try to look at as many sources as possible connected to society, maybe with social media, to kind of, validate or refine what it is that you're trying to figure out. And your superpower is stunning objectivity and the ability to forecast the future based on microscopic trends today. And whether you're analyzing a shift in your social circle or you're implementing a new method at work, you can apply your mind by testing how an isolated concept will alter, how society runs or your collective networks. And you can learn, this is how you learn best. You learn through systemic mapping and crowdsourcing. And so you don't view data in isolation, and that's just it. You can learn by understanding how a single piece of information ripples into an entire global network. And so you need your psychological articles. You need your one-on-one testimonies. You need every variable that you can to validate what it is you're figuring out. But the trap of displacement is becoming detached from human reality when it comes to maybe your communications, or maybe you view people as data points and you forget kind of how to process the weird, fickle things that make humanity what it is. And so you have to consciously zoom back in with this placement. And if you can deliberately apply your brilliant futuristic mind to the immediate emotional needs of, people or humanity or whatever it is that you're pursuing, you have the ability to unlock your genius and to make a difference that's not just going to make a difference today, but for years in the future. If you have a 12th house Mercury, you are a very intuitive translator. You could be a little bit sidekick. And so your intellectual genius is such a deep spiritual empathy and an unparalleled ability to decode what is not seen. And your mind kind of acts as a highly porous, energetic antenna, and you can bypass linear spreadsheets and rigid logic. Even if, maybe you do work that way, maybe you have a Mercury that is very logical like Virgo, but whatever sign your Mercury is in, you can absorb information through the atmosphere almost, and you can absorb the emotional weather of any room you walk into. And so just for an example, imagine you're sitting at a table where everybody is smiling, shaking hands, and verbally agreeing to a plan. While the spreadsheet, for example, shows profit, your mind reads the spiritual bankruptcy of the room. You can completely bypass, the fluff and absorb the heavy static and download what is, unspoken. You can download if someone's feeling resentment or fear, and you can translate invisible energetic tension into sudden intuitive knowing, and you speak the language of the subconscious. And your superpower as well is nonverbal translation. So whether you're navigating a tense silence between friends or solving a problem that has absolutely no obvious data points, you can use your mind to decode the atmosphere, translating the deep static of life into something that is conscious, but also you could download it and translate it into something actionable if you use this placement right as well. And you can learn through kind of osmosis. You have to open up your energy, but obviously selectively, because if you're trying to be highly rigid or aggressive within your environment, this will shut down your mind. You won't live to your fullest potential. And so to truly integrate new knowledge, you must be allowed to sit with the material atmospherically. You must be able to let yourself passively download it and translate it into a linear thought. And because you absorb so much unseen static, the trap of this placement is you could be prone to mental fogginess as well, or you could easily drown into the ocean of maybe other people's unspoken thoughts or lose the boundary of your own mind. And so you must use strict physical anchors. You can try journaling, making music, or adopting rigid grounding routines, because this will kind of pull, your vast open thoughts into a vessel that the waking world can actually interact with. And if you're able to ground yourself, you truly have the ability to have an unmatched genius in whatever you apply your mind to.